And away we go. Here we are with the Principles of Performance podcast. I'm your host, Eric DeGatti, along with my friend and co-host, Mike Perry. Mike, it's just you and I today. It's just the way the guests laid out. We have some super guests over the next couple of months, but you and I have a little more quality time together.
Yeah, it's fun to be able to talk shop and actually discuss sort of what brought us together, which is coaching, training, and education. So we're going to talk about a lot of stuff today, but mostly periodization.
Yeah, so we want to thank one of our mentorship members, Evan Marcantonio, really smart trainer and coach who owns a great facility up in Mike's neck of the woods. And he said, it's fascinating. He said, I've been involved in your mentorship and I've taken your live courses and all your online stuff. And you guys don't really talk about periodization, even though that's the first thing that most people think of when it comes to programming and program design. And so let's talk a little bit about periodization, what it is, where traditional periodization doesn't quite work in today's world and how we can adapt it and actually utilize what we can learn from some of the literature on periodization and how it becomes more applicable for situations that trainers and coaches are actually using right now. So let's kind of start with like what periodization actually is, right? And so if you just kind of look at the definition, it is basically a systematic planning method used in training to optimize performance and minimize risk of overtraining or injury. And it involves dividing a training program into specific phases or cycles, each with a distinct goal, volume, and intensity to elicit specific physiological adaptations and peak performance at a desired time. Okay, so let's talk about what that is. And then there's different types of periodization models. And so within those, I talked about some cycles. There's macro cycles, which is looking at 6 to 12 months, and sometimes even more than that if you're looking at an Olympic cycle of 4 years. You have the mesocycles, which are basically 2 to 6 weeks. And then you have your micro, which is what's happening within the week. And then you have the different types. You have linear, which is kind of this we start at one thing and build to the next and then build to the next and build to the next. And then there's undulating where it can undulate over the course of weeks or months, or it can even undulate within the week in terms of varying out your intensities. There's block where, hey, we're going to work on hypertrophy now, and then we're going to work on speed next, and we're going to work on this next. Or there's conjugate, which was popularized by Westside Barbell, where we're kind of doing a little bit of everything. So Mike, give us kind of your quick, you know, brief overview with broad strokes, like periodization in terms of how it came up in your lexicon coming up in the business and where it kind of stands with you now.
Well, periodization was this magical, like unicorn type word that I learned about when I was a young coach. And it was like, we have to talk about periodization. And I remember just looking at this book and having sort of all this information. I was like, how is this going to work? Like this, like, I don't understand how this is going to work. Like this makes sense and it's awesome, but like, how is this going to work in real life? And that was my biggest issue all along. I was like, anytime I saw these books on periodization and I went down some crazy rabbit holes, I kept on saying to myself, like, this won't work in real life. Like in a particular environment, and we'll talk about this, it will work. But I came to the idea that true periodization in the sense of sports science does not really exist anymore. And if it does, it's less than 1%. And you're talking about basic Olympians. So like the idea of having even 6 to 12 months of a macro cycle usually doesn't happen. Even in pro sports, right? I would say the only true ideas of periodization might come with Olympians. And even then, you don't always have the opportunity to control the various inputs and various outputs, et cetera, because lives are just a little bit crazy. So periodization, in the true sense of the word, unless you have the opportunity to lock people in cabins and feed them and monitor every single aspect of their lives, real periodization doesn't exist.
Yeah. So, Mike, some of the books that Mike's referring to were the Bibles coming up. There's, Super Training by Mel Siff. And then there's the Sciences Practice of Strength Training and by Vladimir Zatsiorsky. And all these books are wonderful literature that, a lot of what we know as modern day strength training comes from. Understand that that was done on Easter Bloc athletes. So when Mike talks about like your clients lived in a cabin and you controlled when they went to bed and when they woke up and what they ate and when they trained and how hard they trained, and you controlled all the variables. Those days, even for Olympians, are gone. If you look at most of your Olympic teams are made up of pro athletes who are playing in their professional sport in the other, times other than the Olympic period. So, you don't have a full 4 years of development, for a lot of the big major sports there. So, and the reality is most coaches and trainers can't lock their people in cabins and control their lives. And so that's where, there's the challenge of like looking at things and breaking them into these very distinct cycles comes into play. Now, then you also look at the modern day athlete. You look at, the old joke, if you watch the Bad News Bears, he says, we do what all ball players do in the winter. We fish and we drink beer and we wait for spring training to come around again, right? That doesn't happen, right? So whether it's down to 9-year-olds who are playing in winter tournaments as baseball players and then playing indoor leagues and then going in travel tournaments and playing spring, summer, fall and playing 100 plus games a year, where is that cycle going to fit in? Where is even the window for development in there? And that's not isolated. That's just about every sport, right? And your kids are going through it lacrosse, and I'm sure it's like, well, if you want to play in the spring team, you got to play on the fall team, and if you play on the spring team, then you have to play in the summer team, and then in between there, in the winter, we're playing indoor leagues and box lacrosse. So where's that development window even happening?
That's a great question. And I can talk about sort of my view on how we do things. But you said something right at the beginning, and it was the definition of periodization. And it was something along the lines to decrease injury risk in overuse training, right? Was that part of the definition?
And that was, if you go on ChatGPT, that is part of the definition where it says to optimize performance and minimize the risk of overtraining or injury. What happens when they show up
See,
overtrained and injured?
well, that is only possible when you can control or modify inputs, right? So, but you can't because people are doing like they're doing way too much. So there is no modification of inputs. It's just a balancing act and a juggling act, right? It's because you can't modify in their life. You just have to do the best you can with what tired athletes showing up. And that's really the problem with it is you don't even have the opportunity. Actually, I'll even take a further step back, Eric, and it's something we talk about is I'll even say to the point of periodization, no one is even taking a step back and looking at the weekly volume of what they're doing and going, hey, like my kid's got 13 practices this week and he's 8. Like that on paper is going to look a little bit different, right? So laying that calendar out and being able to manage what the week's going to look like is a totally different thing as well. But I think right now people think more is better, and that's the problem. They just assume just we have to do everything at once because that's what they think will happen, and they don't even understand that there's a process in which things need to happen for things to stick.
Well, and when we talk about things that are working concurrently, you brought up a point. If you look at a lot of modern day athletes, because we've become so specialized, it is not uncommon for athletes at the pro level and even on down to the high school level where they have a massage therapist, they have an acupuncturist, they have someone who's maybe a movement slash mobility coach, something along those lines. They have their team strength and conditioning coach. Then they also may have another trainer or somebody that works on speed or power or something else on their own. Then they may have some sort of mental skills coach. They have an actual skills coach, plus their skill coaches that are on team. We're up to 8 coaches now, right? And the chances of all them being on the same page and monitoring workload and taking all that into consideration is really tricky. And so being able to quarterback that and be able to be the general contractor to understand all the moving parts is really difficult. And really that's what our biggest role can be is, as you said, managing inputs. Now, if we look at inputs, we also have to take the bigger step back and like what training even is. Charlie Weingart's has some great posts lately and just talking about like it's just a stressor. It's just a stressor like any other stressor. And so with that, the value of those stressors is only as good as your adaptability to come back from those stressors. And so I can't have a blanket program that's going to apply to all because everybody has a different degree of resiliency depending on sleep, stress management, nutrition, hydration, all their other workload volume, those, lifestyle, all these things come into play. Then you take into consideration the dynamic of having the ability to auto regulate because I just mapped out your program for the next 6 months and now all of a sudden you got a cold. Shit, now what? Right. And so that's why if you look back at some of those research, like they would monitor heart rate. This I thought was very cool. They would monitor heart rate when you would go and do a high intensity lift, because if they saw your heart rate elevate beyond a certain percentage before you went into the lift, they'd pull you off the lift. Because if you got too amped up for that training lift, what's going to happen? It's going to have such an impact in terms of fatiguing your central nervous system that it may rob from tomorrow's workout or the workout later today. And so I have to be considerate of that. And so that's where we can learn from periodization. And that's where our whole concept of like our weekly checklist came from, is to say you can't look at this workout in a silo because you need to know what happened the 3 days before, what's going to happen in the next 3 days, what have we done leading up to this week in the 3 weeks before that, what's coming up in the 3 weeks coming. And so we can't look at exercises and workouts in a silo, and we have to appreciate their adaptability. That's a moving target.
Well, and that's the thing. It's a moving target. And you also had mentioned sort of the idea of sort of a biofeedback, right? The see where you're at in auto regulation, rather, not biofeedback, but some similar idea. Um, and I think it's important too when it comes to discussing, this type of training is you have to be in tune with your body a little bit too. You have to be a little bit aware of what's going on, right? Because if you're not sure what you feel like on a good day, or you're not sure what you feel like on a bad day, or they're all bad days, or they're all good days, or you don't have any metric, you just have to be careful about how everything goes. But that's why it's important to have repeatable metrics. And when it comes to biofeedback, yes, feeling good is good, but looking at it could be a toe touch, it could be a vert, it could be whatever, using the repeatable science is going to be a little bit more user friendly when it comes to actually making decisions. But you have to be able to say, hey, look, I'm okay with not going crazy on this training session because tomorrow we have another one coming up. So I think the big thing is, like you said, every decision you make, it has either been impacted or is going to make an impact. And that is how you have to look at your training sessions. And I think if everybody could get on the same page that way, I think kids would do a lot better. And all athletes would, to be honest.
Now, add into the fact that you have a dampened resiliency across cultures, right? You have kids who don't have PE anymore. You have kids that don't go out and play anymore, that don't go and ride bikes. And we now have a generation that is at the all the way to the professional level that grew up in that environment, and it's getting weakened more over time as we're exposed to more environmental toxins, as we're exposed to a worse food supply, as we're getting more in front of screens. You're dealing with a less resilient, less adaptable athlete than you had when this literature was written, nearly 70 years ago. And so we need to take that into consideration as well in terms of how much they can actually handle. And then the irony is that we're giving them way more volume on the sports side. Now, that's not even counting all their skill work and all the competition they're involved with. And then we also need to consider, so like the name on your chest is skill of strength. Why did you come up with that name? All right, because that's getting me to somewhere.
Because strength is a skill. And when I initially heard that phrase from Pavel, it made so much sense to me because I was obsessed with strength training, and I knew that if I could learn these principles of strength training, that I could acquire a higher degree of skill, therefore I would be stronger. So for me, it was always like, hey, give strength the respect that it deserves. And if you do it correctly, you can acquire an incredible skill.
Okay, so love it. Strength is a skill. You know what else is a skill? Sprinting. right? Watch great people
Hmm.
like Les Spellman, Stu McMillan, like, watch people like that talk about sprinting, right? There's a skill of acquisition that you need to acquire to technically actually get benefit from the sprinting itself as to for a physiological adaptation. Power, right? Olympic lifting has
Hmm.
tremendous benefits if you do it right, but it's a highly skilled activity. It's so skilled that they'll give you a medal if you're really good at it, right? It's a sport in and of itself, right? So that is a skill, not to mention movement itself. Being able to move really well is a skill. So if we have to acquire all these skills before we can create physiological adaptations, utilizing those skills. Like you need to learn how to sprint to get a lot of the benefits of sprinting. And so because of that, there needs to be a ramp up period, an on ramp period to acquire the skill. So now we're already bumping up against minimal time. And now where are we factoring the skill acquisition? Or are we just going to run people into the ground and jump and try to skip that step? So we have a lot of people who are tired and sweaty from sprinting, but they still suck at sprinting, right? So we need an on ramp for acquiring the skill. So that adds in another layer to the timepiece. And if we're blocking out 6, 8 week, 12-week cycles, where is that factored in? Because, even if I give an athlete, and generally those cycles will be somewhat variable based on what type of learner you have in front of you. Like I always, would steal from Paul Check. He would say that there's salamanders and there's cats, right? Salamanders, it takes them 6 weeks to learn a lunge. Cats learn it in 6 reps, right? The same thing happens with adaptation within a program. Let's say if I give my better athletes, I'll give them more like 3 week cycles of programs, whereas my general population people, they could go for as much as 8 to 12 weeks with the same workout because they're not getting the acclimatization to the workouts as quickly. And so even with that, your first week is just figuring out how to do it. Like so if you track whether it's the numbers that with the weights that you're moving, if you track the speed of it, if you're using any kind of feedback tool like VBT, you'll notice that it's going to get better and better and better until it gets to a kind of a plateau period. And that's when you know it might be time to make some slight alterations. Um, and so with that, realize the first couple of weeks you're just figuring it out. Like even if you look at real beginners, when absolute beginners start getting doing strength training, they have these tremendous leaps in strength. It's not because they're building muscle; it's just neurological adaptations. So extrapolate that out to somebody who's really dialed in neurologically. You have to factor in a week or two of them just figuring out the program. And then from there, that's where you're getting your physiological adaptations. So that has to get factored into your timing as well. And before you know it, you're starting to run out of weeks in the year.
Well, yeah, because you just keep on adding things to the plate and you never make decisions to take anything off. And then you just get this hodgepodge of just, overload and stimulus where kids just get mediocre at everything and athletes get mediocre at everything and adults get mediocre at everything because they live in that world where as long as they're hot, sweaty, and sore and they're a little banged up, they feel like things are moving in the right direction, but all they're really doing is just replicating that middle over and over again, and they're never going to develop qualities on either end of the spectrum by living in that sort of mishmash of everything.
All right, we're going to get back to that mishmash of everything in a minute. Now, here's another thing to factor into your equation, right? So if you're going to do things in blocks, right? Let's play with the block periodization because that's a really popular one. And even I see high schools doing it, and I could get on a soapbox and show you and explain how this is insanely wrong at the high school level because working with high school teams for 20 plus years. They'll have this is our hypertrophy block, and this is our strength block, and this is our speed block. Okay, so here's my question back. If you understand how physical attributes are not only acquired, but how the rate at which we lose them. All right, you ready? So if you and I, Mike, said for the next month, we're going to do nothing, right? We're just going to sit in a chair, just like George Costanza. It's the summer of George, right? We're just going to sit and do nothing. Okay. Within 2 to 3 weeks, we'd start to lose our strength, right? In about 7 to 10 days, we'd lose our power. And it's twice as fast in older adults. 10 to 14 days, we're going to lose our speed. In about a week or two, we're going to start to lose some of our aerobic fitness and our mobility. So my question is, if that's the case, how am I going to take 3 months off of any of those attributes? Because I'm going to basically give them away. And now I have to rebuild them from scratch.
Yeah, it's now, and here's the other thing, guys, right? That doesn't take into account poor sleep, poor nutrition, financial stress, emotional stress, life stress, right? Like these are uncolored scientific attributes, right? And that's just the norm. That's not life, right? So you add life, poor sleep, ton of alcohol, whatever it is, this this is going to be impacted a lot differently. So, and this is just the normal detraining, right? You factor in a bunch of really really shitty habits. I'm not saying it's going to move that much faster, but I will say this: you're not going to feel that much better, for sure. So, um, these are important things to understand because depending on what you do and depending what you ask of your body, um, there are times where sports and environments combine a lot of these. And for example, like jujitsu, you take time off the mat, you take 2 weeks off the mat, and you haven't rolled hard, and you go back. Man, it's awful, especially if you're 45 years old. So there's other considerations like that. Is how well can your body handle that type of abuse over time? Because there are instances where you put yourself in an environment and you're so acclimated to that environment, and then it may not be a healthy environment, but your body's acclimated to it, and then you take time off and you feel a lot different, potentially a lot better, and then you go back to that same exercise. It can really leave you banged up again. So that's another consideration too about qualities is, I call it like the ability to fall down and not get broken, right? It's kind of like, can you, as an older adult, can you take a digger and not break a hip and blow something out? So I'm not saying that that's the goal, but a big part of it is stuff like that people, there is no science and there is no literature that says how that's going to look, but in real life, you do those sports that require a lot of different attributes, you'll lose it a lot faster, and trying to recapture it is that much harder.
Now, let's go glass half full, and then I'm going to give you a practical application of where this fits in. On the good side, all right, I'm going to quote an Italian sports scientist, Tudor Bompa, and he had a famous line in his book, and he would say, "Soon ripe, soon rotten." And what that means is that so let's say in this arbitrary case, you and I, Mike, are going to take a month off of all physical activity, but if we had the exact same level of all these different attributes, strength, power, speed, aerobic fitness, so forth, but it took you acquired it over 5 years and I acquired it over 5 months, I'm going to lose it much faster, right? Soon ripe, soon rotten. And so the longer you've been training, the longer your training age, the less that you will lose over time, right? And so the key then is the long term accumulation, right? And having a long term continual base allows you and affords you to have a little bit more time off, so you don't have to train all these attributes as much. The other thing is it takes a relatively minimal to preserve each of these attributes, right? So you may not gain speed, but if you can still train speed once a week, you'll preserve most of your speed, right? So knowing that, this is where my battle would come in with the high school coaches again, where and it still happens at every level, is where coaches will get so wrapped up in the competitive season and the skill component that they'll abandon strength and conditioning. And so it's the silliest thing that, like, I would tell coaches, look, it either works or it doesn't. It either matters or it doesn't. If it mattered so much that you're screaming at kids in the hallway that they have to be in the weight room in December for when they're not going to play a game until next September, if it mattered that much that they had to be there for all those lifts then, why does it not matter now when the actual season happens? Because if, again, we can take a step back to all of this, how does this work? It works because you lift heavy things. Your body goes, holy shit, if you're going to keep doing that, I'm going to have to get stronger. And so if you stop doing it, guess what your body says? I guess I don't need to be strong anymore. And so you stop lifting right when your competition starts. And as your season goes on, you're progressively getting weaker. And when you have your most meaningful games, you're at your weakest point of the entire year. So talk about periodization. If you're not doing in-season training, I don't give a shit what you do in your off season. It doesn't matter. It's all going to get given away based on those numbers that I gave you earlier. But here's the thing. You don't need much. I would get high school football teams. We would have 2 lifts a week. Early in the week, we'd have a more heavy duty strength type workout where we'd have one big upper body lift. Generally, it's bench press, just because that kind of feeds what the coaches want, and have one heavy lower body lift, whether it's a squat or a deadlift, right? And then we'd have some accessory work programmed around that. And then the second lift of the week was day before the game, sometimes even day of the game, depending on when how the schedule broke out. And that was all explosive speed based stuff, right? Where you're not getting any
Yep.
level of fatigue whatsoever. It was, more Olympic lifts and split jerks and jumps and that kind of thing. And I would get 50, 60 players in and out of the weight room in 25 minutes total. And we stayed strong and explosive through the whole season, and sometimes even went up a tick, because Mother Nature was still having a nice little testosterone drip at that age. So it doesn't take much to keep it. And if you can't invest 25 minutes twice a week, then you know what? You're not serious about your program.
Yeah. It's funny you said that because I knew you were going with the in season. Someone asked me the other day, they said, hey, I've always sort of struggled with in season training. This was a skills coach. And he wanted to ask me what I thought. And this was my response to him. I said, the main goal of in season training is to preserve all of the work that you did prior to the season beginning. It's not to necessarily move the needle, it's to preserve the qualities that you worked so hard for. Dosed correctly, you can maintain those qualities very easily. And then sent him a basic sheet, and per your what you were saying earlier is there's certain qualities that you lose a little bit quicker, speed being one of them. So if you know that speed is a quality that you can easily lose, why would you not want to preserve that quality in season? Now, it needs to be done correctly with the right environment, with the right dose, with the right work to rest ratio, but it's easily done. And if you do it correctly, like you said, athletes will not only preserve, sometimes they get a little bit faster because you get that testosterone. And it has to be dosed simply and effectively, but it absolutely works. And it's just bananas to me. It's like you work so hard, and I see these kids doing it. They work so hard. I've seen it in pros. They work so hard getting prepared for the season, and they go out in the beginning of the season, and the first 4 to 6 games they're crushing it. And then it starts to get a little injuries add up and et cetera, and they don't train. And eventually by the end of the season, they're just beaten up again. And now what do we have to do? We have to refill everything again and start from scratch. Whereas they could have easily kept themselves healthier, and probably on the pitch more at that point by just dedicating, again, an hour a week. It's not that hard. It just has to be done correctly.
Yeah, and that's a very valid point too. I'm glad you brought up is that you have to have also an on-ramp period when you get back into your in season. And again, something that high school coaches get dead wrong is you have kids that you haven't lifted since the summer because you wanted to have them on the field for only football, let's say. Now all of a sudden you're going to bring them back in December for late December for lifting. And what do day one? You max test them. Like these kids have just gotten their asses kicked for 4 months between four practices a week in games. And now all of a sudden you want to max strength test them? Like, come on, we need to be better than that, right? So there needs to be an on-ramp period. There needs to be time to kind of just get acclimated to like feel normal again. And so you need to appreciate that. And that's why I would always have an intro period, depending on how deep our season went, of at least 2 to 4 weeks, where we're going to do primarily unilateral work to clean out some of the kinks right to left. We're going to do a lot of kind of rebuilding of movement skills and so forth before we're even worried about touching barbells and trying for max efforts, right? We just need to get you back into a groove. Now, if you're sitting there and you're saying, okay, well, if we don't stop addressing strength, speed, power, aerobic fitness, so forth all year, and we're running this concurrent model or conjugate model, right, or some variation of it, how do you fit it all in? So if I could change one word in the lexicon of training is if I could replace periodization with prioritization, right? And
Love
so
it.
if we can have a seasonal prioritization model. Now, what this is saying not everything has equal priority all throughout the year, right? So I use and I'm going to kind of jump a little out of order here. I use the example of a totem pole, right? And so if anybody's familiar with what a totem pole is, it's what Native Americans would use. They'd have these carved long, like tree trunk type poles, they would carve images of people within the tribe, with the chief being on top and then working its way down the social ladder. And so when they talk about low man on the totem pole, that comes from being, okay, you're the guy who cleans the teepees, like you're the low man in this tribe, and then there's the chief on top. Well, if you look at all the physical attributes or the activities that someone's involved in, this is what I sit down with an athlete and say, well, let's forecast your year. And so let's take an example of a high school athlete, and we can adapt this into any scenario. But we have a high school athlete where maybe their primary sport is baseball, but they also play basketball for fun and they play soccer in the fall, right? That their ultimate goal is they'd like to play at the next level in baseball. All right. Well, if you're doing that, you're playing baseball competitively in the spring and summer, you're playing soccer in the fall, and you're playing basketball in the winter. There's no off season there, right? So now we still have to fit training in, but here's how it's going to have to kind of adapt. All right. So when they're playing soccer, how much energy system training do I need? None. They're getting all of it on the field, right? It's already getting covered. I don't need to do any of that. So I'm going to back off my energy system training. But that's where at a period where I can focus on strength and some of the power. Um, if now I go into basketball, there's probably a little bit of speed being covered there that I don't need to cover as much, right? And they're still getting energy system stuff. I don't need to work there, but it's still a window for me to train strength. But here's the thing. I can train you to a certain level of intensity and volume, because if you show up to your basketball game and you're a little sore and you're a little slow and maybe you're not, your absolute 100% best, it doesn't matter to me because that's not your priority, right? Right now, training is actually above basketball or soccer in terms of the totem pole. Now, once it starts to get now to early March, and now you have to have a glove on and your cleats on and you're playing baseball, well, guess what? My training goes all the way to the bottom. And so I can't have you show up tired, sore, beat up, and broken down to baseball, because that's the whole reason we're training. We can't lose sight of that's the whole reason we're doing all this development. And so I need to have you at your best. So I take the back seat. I kind of hand the keys, uh, you know, uh, figuratively to the baseball coach and say, it's much more of you now than it is me. Now, in the summer, you have a little bit more time because now there's not school, there's a little more freedom. So now I can ramp it back up to a little bit more. And I kind of go through the cycle. I have to know where I fit on that totem pole with your training. And that's where I call it a seasonal prioritization model.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that approach. And the other thing too is, as a strength and conditioning coach, you have to have the ability to analyze sort of the sport and what are the demands of the sport. Because another way you can look at it is, what are the adaptations of your current decisions? Like if you're playing basketball 5 days a week, what's going to come of you playing basketball 5 days a week? Yeah, you're going to get better at basketball. Absolutely. But there's a trade-off. What else are you leaving behind because you're doing that 5 days a week? So I think that's another way to look at it, because if you're doing a certain thing all the time, you will get a certain result. So you have to think about what are the adaptations that what are the adaptations that I'm looking to get, and what am I currently doing, and what are the adaptations that I'm currently getting from my routine. And if they don't match, things they need to go in a certain direction. So that's another way to look at it, because again, I think about like lacrosse right now for my son. He's playing a lot of lacrosse and he's still in the gym twice a week. Our main goal right now is movement quality, strength maintenance, and right now, just a little bit of speed training and deceleration work. That's it. Just light decel work. And that's it. But it's dosed very, very simply because he's getting so much lacrosse. I don't do any conditioning. I don't do any even high intensity work with him sprinting short distances, but we're never ramping him up from a heart rate standpoint. We're strength training. We're working on mobility. We're trying to keep him sharp. We're trying to keep his skills up to par and focus on the recovery aspect. And that's the whole idea of prioritization. Like he's in season now, and that is what he should be focusing on.
Now, don't hear what Mike's not saying. If you're out there and you're the mom or dad saying, okay, well, if my son is a lacrosse player and he also wrestles in the winter, well, wrestling doesn't help you with lacrosse directly, so he should quit wrestling. No, There is an there when you look at year-round sports or multiple sport athletes. I love this. We took this when Eric Cressy was on, and he talks about you have to understand the opportunity cost that, right? So if you're spending time doing this, it's time you can't spend training. But at the same time, what's the bigger opportunity cost? That or in 10 years from now, you're regretting that you miss being with your friends and the times on the bus and the locker room and the camaraderie and everything that goes along with being on your high school basketball team, lacrosse team, whatever it may be. Is it worth that 2 months of training? Like, was that really going to move the needle? Or in the grand scheme of life, you know, can you keep that in perspective? And on the flip side, I could say the same thing about how many, dads, force their kids to run track because they think it's going to make them faster for football. Well, if your track coach there scrolling on his phone while you run endless laps, and then you're going to sit around all day, 3 times a week to run 1 22-second heat, when you could have been in the gym that whole time, you didn't get faster. You actually got slower and weaker that season. And so unless you have a really good, accomplished track coach that knows how to build that speed while maintaining your strength and gets you in the weight room and keeps you maintained as an athlete, then no, then you wasted your time. Your opportunity cost was lost. You should have been training instead. So we have to kind of look at things from a lot of different angles, and then understand also when I talk about this prioritization model that there's an old expression, there's a proverb that says if you chase two rabbits, you won't catch either one. That the more stuff we put into the pot, the less of each you will get, which you know what? For a lot of people, I'm okay with. And I'm going to circle back to this kind of GPP, SPP concept, but I want to kind of highlight a client that I had for many, many years, and I love him to death. But when I kid you not, when I would say, because I said to all my clients, all right, we're going to re-up your program, we're going to, looking into the next phase. What are we looking to accomplish in the next 1 to 3 months? I say it all the time. I just had a bunch of coaching sessions yesterday. Okay, tell me what the next 1 to 3 months is. What are the things we really want to focus on and hammer on? This guy literally would tell me, well, I want to get my bench and the deadlift and my squat up, but I also want to get ready for a triathlon. I also want to get ripped for a bachelor party I'm going to, or I'm going to be on a boat. I also want to get a couple strokes off my golf game. And then I also want to work on getting much more mobility for my back pain. On top of that, this guy was like a high level executive at his family's company. And it's like, dude, come on. How many things you think you're going to get good at any of those at once, right? Not to mention you're on the road for 40% of your life. So understand the more things you're trying to focus on, the less of each you're going to get. And for some people, that's okay. And that comes down to the question of how much do you really need? And then how much do you have? Right. We just had a great example. I think it was a case study in our mentorship where it talked about a woman was trying to get back to running. Right. And she wasn't get back to running to win the Boston Marathon. She didn't even care about winning her local 5K. She wanted to run so she could run with her dad, right? She just wanted to run pain free with her dad and not get smoked, right? Not get left in the dust. Like, so how much running focus do we need? We just need her to be able to run and keep up with dad. That's it, right? So that's a little bit easier than saying the woman I met yesterday who wants to actually run the New York City Marathon, right? So how much do you have versus how much do you need? Then you have the bigger thing that comes into play that I think is incredibly overlooked, which goes into this whole periodization thing, is that how specialized you actually need your training to be. If I tie it in with talking about the general overall poor resiliency, we also have really poor general physical preparedness in most human beings, let alone, and part of that cohort is our athletes at all levels. And so, because of that, unless you've checked the boxes of having really good, just general physical preparedness, I don't care about special training. I don't care about specialized phases or training or any of it, right? And Jim Wendler said it best. Do I really need to read Zaziorsky if you can't do a fucking push-up, right? So that's where the whole concept of GPP versus SPP, like you train some of the best fighters in the world who scored some of the highest scores that the UFC training center's ever seen. How many of them really need specialized MMA training?
They didn't. They were highly skilled fighters, and I would say intermediate strength athletes, but from an energy system standpoint, that was something that we really took a long time to dial in. And that's something that it was a process to try to get them to understand, especially with fighters, because fighters train more when they're anxious. That's just kind of what I've noticed is they train more when they almost don't trust the process. And that's something that I've just seen. So you have to make a lot of good decisions and let them know the reasoning behind the decisions as well, because that's a super important component of it. But you're right, it's the general physical preparedness. That's all. I'm convinced that the reason why I've done a good job with athletes is all I'm doing is filling gaps in their GPP. That's it. Like it maybe it looks fancy, but all I'm doing is filling the holes. And it sounds kind of silly, but I mean, I think I told you this. We just recently put in our eval jump rope per athletes. Can you jump rope? Just yes or no for 30 seconds. Can you a skip? Can you give me 15 a skips in 15 yards? Right. Gives them a little bit of, layout and planning that they have to, look into while they're skipping. We've had to put those in because we are getting athletes now that are higher. They have a higher level of skill in their sport, but a really, really piss poor foundation. And while they believe doing more of the specialized things will move the needle, just by if they just simply fill in the GPP gaps, like learn how to posterior weight shift, learn how to skip, learn how to balance on one leg, that that will yield the biggest ROI than anything. You can call it whatever you want, but I'm just, people will call it this and that, but it's really just filling gaps in GPP, finding the things that like kids and athletes should be able to do, and making sure that they can do the basics. And you'd be amazed at what you can mine just out of watching an athlete skip and jump rope.
I'm going to take a different perspective and give everybody a different lens to look at this thing through. Now, what again, don't hear what Mike's not saying. If you were just really good at GPP, you'd probably get a lot of people better, but you're not going to be elite. Elite, you need to understand and appreciate the dynamics of a given activity at a certain level. You need to understand the energy systems. You need to understand the movement demands. You need to understand the force output and force absorption demands, right? You need to understand all those things. But you understand them not so you can give a bunch of fancy exercises for each of them. I want to understand them to make sure I can train you and give you as hard as possible and give you as much GPP as possible without robbing from those skills. That's a very different perspective,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if you take most people and they say, okay, if a PGA Tour golfer walked into your door, most people are automatically thinking, okay, what do I have that kind of looks, feels, smells like golf that I can give this person? And they want to make everything golf specific. I want to look at them and say, okay, I want to look at what are all the physical attributes from a mobility, from a control, from a movement, strength, power, skill perspective that you own right now that makes you good at your sport? And how hard can I train you? And then can I keep watching those dials to make sure I don't rob any of those from you? And if I can give you a whole lot more horsepower and you don't lose any of those skill attributes, you are a significantly better athlete. That is a very different approach and lens to look at things through, right? So instead of trying to run through ladders and then catch a ball, right, and thinking that's sport specific, I want to look at say, what is it that you have? Because unfortunately, a lot of training will do that, right? I've seen a lot of athletes who've told me I was way more athletic in college until I started, into my pro strength program, and I've lost athleticism. Like that's insane to me. But if I look at it and say, okay, well, I know that for your given activity, you need this much movement, you need this much ability to react to stimulus, you need all that stuff. I'm going to make sure I keep checking in on those, that you maintain all those. And if I increase your GPP, those things will increase too. But if those things go down, I've now screwed up, right? If I've robbed you of layback as a pitcher because I made you super strong in a bench press, but now you've lost some layback. And so now that takes away, it's now altered your mechanics as a pitcher. well, then my program sucks. Did I need to go and have a super specialized driveline program for you instead? No. It means that I need to understand what are the attributes you need and what can I not, what's non-negotiable I can't give away. And then how do I add as much horsepower to those attributes as possible? And then maybe some of the sprinkling on the cake is some of those specialized things, but only once you've checked your GPP boxes, right? Do I need to do a specialized weighted ball program if you can't do a push up? No, you can't. You've already demonstrated, so you can't transmit force through your body and into your hand and back through your body. So, what's the point of adding a weighted ball to it? So, this is unfortunately not the perspective we take. We take the perspective of looking at the sport, simulate the sport, as opposed to looking at the sport and say, okay, what are you good at the sport? What are you lacking? And then I'm going to fill in the gaps in what you're lacking. But I have to also monitor those dials to make sure that I don't take away what you're already good at. Because if you were not good at anything, you would have quit your sport. You would have moved on to another sport. If you struck out every single time you got up at the plate, you would have quit and moved to lacrosse, right? But you didn't. There's something that you have. You're missing a piece, and my job is to fill in that missing piece. It's not to give you specialized 9,000 specialized baseball drills.
And I think, to put a bow on it too, I think a lot of the times the missing piece may be something that isn't within our domain, right? Like I've had discussions with parents. I'm like, I did my job. Like they're bigger, stronger, faster, just as mobile. They just suck at their sport. Like they need to play their sport. You can't become a better pitcher by just spending time in the weight room, or a better soccer player. So I think that's the other component too, is just managing expectations too, because there needs to be a focus of everything. So, but no, I mean, man, we covered a lot. Anything else you want to touch upon as we get to the end of this thing, bud?
Yeah, I'm just going to hammer in again because I want this to kind of, if this can click and people run with it, is let's forget about periodization. Let's focus on prioritization. Okay. And then how do you
Yeah.
understand prioritization? We use in our live course, I use the example of the story of the jar of life and understanding what are your big rocks you're going to focus on and not get worried about sand. But how do you understand what are the big rocks? Well, one is just simply ask. Right. I have a conversation I have with all my athletes. It could apply to your general fitness people too. Is I have my magic wand conversation. Say, look, if I had a magic wand in my cabinet over there, and I could give you one thing physically that you could have that you don't have now, that would take you to that would take you where to want to be, or make you much more confident stepping on the field or court or track. What would that one thing be? Because they know what's holding them back from getting to the next level, and ask them. And then back that up with data, right? Back it up with data to say, I had a client last night. She swore she had tight hips. She's a 9 on a Beighton scale. She's hypermobile. She can palm the floor. She's hypermobile in every single joint she has, right? So if she says she has tight hips, and then I just give her a flexibility program, and she's someone who has very, loose, unstable joints, I ruined her. So make sure you can back up what they say with the data and what makes sense of that. And then just keep checking those things, checking in with them. What's the biggest focus now? What's our prioritization for the next month to 3 months? And that sets your cycles. And then from there, back it up with data to say, okay, well, look, we've got the strength, I think, pretty much to where we need to have it. That's why we have our belt system in our exercise coach course. We've got the strength pretty much where we need to have it. I don't know if another 5 pounds on the bar is going to move the needle, but I know if I can get you a little more stable, or if I know I can get you a little more explosive, I think that's going to be the game changer here. And I wouldn't know that unless I had some metrics to lean into. So feedback from a subjective standpoint, and always checking in, where are you at, what do you need, what are we going to focus in on, and then from an objective measure, having a system is going to drive all these decisions. And that's where you create your prioritization from. And so that's where I want to kind of leave us today with looking at periodization. Scratch that. Let's look at modern day 2025 real life. It's more about prioritization.
Yep, absolutely.
All right. Well, that's going to be a wrap for us. We got a bunch of cool guests coming up in the next few months, and we appreciate you tuning in and listening. Please spread the word. And this has been the Principles of Performance podcast.